Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Steve. Welcome to All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo.
There's so much to love about this amazing show, and we're happy to connect to fans like us who discover new things with each rewatch.
Be advised, while we aren't gratuitous with spoilers, they can pop up as we discuss character arcs through the final season. Let's get started with Mad Men C to Z.
Welcome to Season 5, Episode 12, Commissions and Fees. This episode was written by Andre and Maria Jacquemetton and directed by Christopher Manley. The first scene opens with Dawn at the barber, and we don't normally get stranger comes in and gives us important exposition in Mad Men, but in this scene, we learn it's all around town that SCDP got Jaguar, so now they're famous for a good reason.
Yeah, it's Jed Covington representing Dancer. And he says a number of things to Dawn. You know, there's this recognition that he's the man who won the Jaguar account. And then he also throws in that Pete Campbell really impressed Jaguar, and this is a big win for Dawn's agency. In the midst of the good strokes for Dawn, I think it's pretty clear that the notion that Pete Campbell is part and parcel of this success is probably not music to Dawn's ears.
There's also this little tidbit that we know Lou Avery hasn't appeared yet in Mad Men, but he's from Dancer and not the most artistic fellow, we might say. So when Jed says their creative went home early on the Jaguar campaign, that's kind of a funny slam of Lou already.
And Dawn, he seems modest about it. He's not tooting his own horn or looking too puffed up about it. He doesn't mention the Joan trick that they did to try and win the business.
I imagine that's not part of their fairy tale success story.
The next scene takes us to Lane with someone from the 4As. He's flattering Lane and talking about the great job he's done, and then mentions that they have an unelected position as the head of their Fiscal Control Commission that they would like Lane to take. This is very complimentary to Lane, and we can see Lane is very pleased.
I missed it on earlier rewatches, but remember earlier in the season, Lane was so proud of being accepted as a member of the 4As. And then he mentioned it to the partners, and nobody said anything nice about it. It wasn't a big deal. For Roger, of course he'll be invited to some stupid organization with drinks and business cards. But for Lane, this is a crucial marker of belonging and fitting in with peers in the U.S. with this distinction. It's a sign he's arrived. And of course, we saw Lane forging a check. And the fact that the 4As want him to be the head of fiscal control, there's a twinge knowing how happy this recognition makes him and also how underhanded he's been with finance.
The next scene takes us to the partners meeting, and we can see the changes that have taken place now that Joan is a junior partner. Scarlett is now the admin assistant attending the meeting, and we can see a little back and forth as Joan guides her in what needs to be done in terms of taking the minutes and then working through the agenda for the meeting.
I'm not sure why it's Scarlett, who's Harry's secretary, who's taking notes at the partners meeting instead of Roger's or Pete's or Don's. I also have a sidebar question about why Lane and Ken don't seem to have secretaries at all, because as a partner, I feel like Lane should have one, and as an account man, Ken should. But I accept that Mad Men already has a bunch of characters and they can't show all of them. But still, given Harry cannot keep a secret, I would never invite his secretary in to take notes when there has to be confidential information at these meetings.
The client is requesting to go to a fee structure, and Don Draper is immediately hostile to that. He wants to stick to the old commission structure. And then the larger question comes up as to this trend in advertising at this point of time where more clients are wanting to go to fees from commission, and the general hostility there is from the ad agencies of going to this because it can potentially mean less billings.
This scene has a payoff later on, even though it's a fairly short mention here about the difference between fee structure and commission percentage. Since Joan is going to explain that to a professor later, it's notable to me that the partners here need it spelled out. I mean, not that they don't catch on quickly, and of course it's really the scene exists for the audience to get it. So essentially the difference is that a client could pay an ad firm a percentage based on their media budget or based on revenue generated, or they could pay for the exact hours and services a firm spends specifically on that client's account.
Pete, representing accounts, seems to be willing to at least contemplate the change. and mentions some new business in Dunlop, a lesser tire firm, as a potential client that would be interested in making this switch as well. Don reacts and says that he's already said no, and then makes a snide remark that maybe he should leave so they can do whatever they want in his absence. And that's a direct reference to Pete's machinations that were behind the Joan arrangement with Jaguar.
In the next scene, we see Betty's family planning a ski trip, and Sally gets out of it, asking to go to Don's instead. And Betty is really offended that Sally would rather be with Don and Megan than go on vacation with them. And her hurt, predictably, comes out in these insults and accusations. And I feel like we see Sally bringing more and more bite to her arguments, like when she says, Megan lets me eat whatever I want, and we know Betty's sensitive to food.
And Sally even, sort of craps on the destination, a cold skiing location versus going to warm West Coast Disneyland. So she's really pushing all Betty's buttons here in terms of Betty's insecurities. But it seems like Betty rolls over fairly quickly here and just says, rather than fight and feud with Sally, it's easier to just not bring her along at all, let her go hang out at Don and Megan's. And none of this has been arranged with them in advance.
I hate how Betty treats Sally, and at the same time, I admit that I find this cut very funny when she calls Don and she opens with, I was wondering if you have any problem with me strangling Sally. And Don is very day-to-day about this. He's like, should we be having this discussion on the phone? Which is, I like when Don has a little bit of humor. This is an aside, but I notice Betty and Pete both have this old-fashioned way of speaking that stands out more than most of the other characters. In this scene, Betty describes Sally as being fresh and having a sourpuss, which Pete once used about Hildy. And I feel like sprinkling that very precise, dated vocabulary is so smart because if it were constant, the use would be too distracting for the audience. But here, it helps remind us this flavor, this time, this person.
And just in terms of the relationship between Betty and Don, she's not asking here. She's telling. She's not bringing Sally along, and Don will need to take her. This isn't doing her a favor. This is just how it's going to be.
And Betty is so cold and awful when she talks about Sally. I think we're much more protective about kids in the U.S. now, so her language would always have been inappropriate, but it's still really shocking. And I can't imagine having any of these thoughts about my daughter, much less voicing them, but this idea, we're dropping her off, she can sleep with the doorman for all I care. I know people reach their limits and they say terrible things, the way Francine said she would poison everybody at her holiday dinner when she found out Carlton was cheating. But it's really hard to have sympathy for Betty when she gets this upset about Sally being an age-appropriate, rude teenager. It's not that she did anything so over the top.
It really seems Betty is being painted as the villain here. These are kind of frictions that teenage girls have with their mothers. But it seems like we get to see sort of Betty at her worst a lot, and it really villainizes her. I get it, she's not the greatest mom in the world, but I also have to say I'm not a huge fan of this writing for Betty's character because I think it diminishes and simplifies her as a character compared to the other side. And I guess we could say later in this episode we get a peek at that other side, but it seems like there's a lot of this type of stuff for Betty's character and not a lot of the other side of the coin.
I definitely agree. I think a more nuanced portrayal would show her being narcissistic and selfish about Sally preferring to be at Don and Megan's, but also affection. Like she doesn't brush Sally's hair aside off her forehead or touch her shoulder or anything. So I think that duality of the affection with the impatience is probably much more true to life for more characters than not, or for this particular character anyway. Next, we find out Bert was investigating the fee structure and commission situation with their books, and that's how he comes across the canceled check he brings to Don's attention. And he could have just as easily gone to Lane first about this, so I wonder if things would have played out differently if he had. And I have to assume Bert figures out the gist of what happens later on, because it's too hard to believe Don just says, oh, I'll take care of this, and not give Bert any other explanation for it, especially since Bert knows Don has pulled off a huge deception before. So if I'm Bert, I'm going to need a much better answer from Don than, oh, I'll take care of it from the guy whose name is on the check.
I think Bert has already assumed what it is. It's a bonus. what can Lane say? As far as Bert's assumption goes, I think he's assuming Lane says, "Oh, I got a bonus from Don and I'm very grateful." Then Bert still is left with needing to address this with Don as the senior partner, and they had agreed not to pay bonuses. And that's not the case. And of course, Don Draper is completely surprised and knows he never signed the check. So Don instantly knows it's something bigger than just a senior partner tilting against the rest of them and paying out a bonus to somebody.
This next scene is, I think, the heart of the episode, and it's performed so brilliantly. Jared Harris is fantastic. In the last episode, we talked about Don going through the 5 stages of grief in one scene when Peggy tells him she's leaving. And here Lane does the same. He denies, he fights, he pleads, he flatters, he weeps. It's masterfully acted.
It's a powerful scene, and Don Draper is really calling the shots. So as he confronts Lane with what Don knows is a fraudulent check, Lane is trying to evade and trying to pretend, oh, Don did sign it and must have forgotten, and Don's having no part of it. And at each attempt to extricate himself from it, Lane faces a very stern Don, basically threatening escalation. We can get a professional in to ask you these same questions. How many more are there? And as much as Lane wiggles and squirms, he quickly realizes there's nowhere to hide, and Don's got him. And I think it irritates Don that he is trying to wiggle out of this until he finally comes clean.
We can see in this scene so much pent-up anger Lane has been carrying. And I don't think it's entirely at Don for having more money, even though that's what he talks about. I think his anger is at the Brits for treating him like nothing, and the partners for overriding and ignoring him, and his father for abusing him, and everybody who ever tried to keep him down. It's whiny, but it's so honest, this rage at the injustices he feels. He's never going to be the good-looking hero who saunters in and saves the day and gets the girl. But I think he wanted to be that. He saw Don being that and wanted it. And why should Don Draper have that and not him? Why is it okay for Pete to arrange to pimp Joan out? And why is it okay for Roger to sell the company in Dodd's absence so he can get cash for his divorce, or to lose Lucky Strike, his one client? And Lane ends up being the loser, but they all get away with it. It comes across being very self-centered and pathetic, but I can certainly understand and empathize with his feelings about it.
And also, I think there's an irony in, as much as the things Lane are saying we could say are true, or that's a very valid point of view he has on it, all these various complaints and wrongs. But in the end, it doesn't excuse embezzling funds, fraudulently signing a check in Don Draper's name. And that fundamental truth is the touchstone that Don Draper keeps coming back to. He's not arguing with Lane about those other points. He's just bringing it back to that truth. We can't overlook this. There is no alternative. You need to resign.
And we know Don is a hypocrite. He's done plenty of things that aren't in the best interests of the company. But he is firing Lane for the right reason here. He isn't trying to wound Lane or anybody else. He's not flexing power for show. He's not trying to cover up his own error. I feel like the only reason Don fires him is because he really is looking out for the company and its future.
Yeah, I think Don's telling the truth when he says, I'm sorry, I can't trust you. I'll cover the money you need. Can you imagine if a client found out? And he's even gentle in the way he terminates him. They're not marching him out the door. Don is allowing Lane to tender his resignation. He can time that and pitch that in whatever way he wants to the people in his life who are going to have to be made aware of it. I hesitate to call it generous because I don't think that's the right word, but it's as soft a termination as I think you could ask in the circumstances. And I don't think Don takes any joy or glee in doing this. He's viewing it as a necessity that has to happen. If your finance guy is committing fraud and embezzling funds, for whatever reasons, it's intolerable. You cannot run a firm that way.
And this line Don says, especially knowing what's coming, take the weekend, think of an elegant exit. Ugh, it hurts. When Don tells Lane the next thing will be better because it always is, I think he's trying to do right by Lane. This is the truth as Don sees it. He gave the same advice to Peggy. He gave this advice to Freddie. Move forward is Don's go-to lesson. But Lane doesn't have that same capacity. Moving to America was his chance to move forward and be someone new. And for a while, it seems like it was working out for him. But he didn't leave that person behind. Those same insecurities came with him.
And there's so many practical considerations for Lane, right? Like we know he's got terrible cash flow. So even with earning a salary, he had cash flow problems. So now losing his job and whatever gap that's going to create before he can start earning again is a huge issue with all these bills that have been piled up. And then we also know that his visa is contingent upon this position. And then he needs to leave the United States. So it would force him to go back to the UK. And as we know, he's been fleeing the UK and everything it stands for in his mind, and this was everything for him. So all this is now being blocked to him, and he will need to go back cap in hand to that place that he's wanted to stay away from. I'm not sure Don really appreciates just how every piece of his world has imploded at this point of Lane's world.
And Lane doesn't have a new hope or vision of what his future could look like. Being without his visa and being without money are certainly serious roadblocks to his future, but not being able to see or believe in a better version of himself, when you take that away, it's really crushing. And I agree. I don't think Don has any appreciation of that.
As you pointed out, Jared Harris's acting in this scene, I think he just strikes that perfect balance. There's emotion, but it's under control and being constrained, and then it bubbles out. His pleading is so pathetic, even as he drinks, the drink that Dawn offered him and is sort of collapsing as he realizes the implications in his life. We can feel the tragedy engulfing him here.
On his way out of Don's office, Lane takes that glass with the drink from Don. Is that his legacy? Don leaves Lane with a drink. Ugh, it's so painful.
And again, Don is trying to be, I think, as kind as he can be in the circumstances. When Lane says he's lightheaded, Don says, that's relief. I've started over a lot, Lane. This is the worst part. He's putting it in terms that relate to Don's life and the various times he's started over. I don't think he realizes quite the scorched earth situation that Lane finds himself in.
We know Lane and Joan have had a mutual respect for each other, and I don't know if Lane feels beyond hope now, or if somehow he could say something and Joan would work some kind of miracle. But Lane is very drunk and sloppy, and her last words to him end up being, I think you should take your party elsewhere, which he does in a couple of different ways. And his last words to her are, bon voyage. So heartbreaking, this scene.
Yeah, it really is. And this deliberate crudeness from him, it's almost like he's trying to push her away in order to lessen the pain of this parting. And of course, she's oblivious to the state he's in. And I think maybe after the fact, she'll think, oh gosh, that was, a comment very unlike Lane. He doesn't say those sorts of things, but in this moment he does. And it's, again, it just feels tragic that that's his last interaction with Joan.
There are so many what ifs. If he hadn't tried to kiss her, if she hadn't had a lifetime of rebuffing men like this. Yes, to her, that isn't this is very out of character and my radar should go up that something's wrong with him. For her, this is, ugh, not you two. And we, of course, understand differently. It makes it hurt so much more. Every time he reaches out, he doesn't get what he needs. When Lane goes back to his office alone, it's snowing even harder outside through the window. It's really beautiful. The shot is just gorgeous. Lane downs his drink and he looks around his office. There's a Statue of Liberty figurine behind him you can see. Again, just this reinforcing Lane was trying to make a certain kind of American dream work, and it's all ending. Ugh, it's so dark and it's so tragic.
Yeah, it's very desolate, very barren, and the weather just epitomizes it. A storm is coming in, and certainly Lane's life is in that place.
Down the hall, Roger's flirting with a young woman on the phone, and Don comes in to vent without saying anything about Lane. I don't think Don should gossip, but Lane being fired seems like a really big deal that the other partners should know about. And Don just decides not to say anything. And I know He told Lane to resign, so he's trying to give him space for that. But again, this is Don Draper being the Lone Ranger and making that call. And at least to Roger and Bert, I mean, I guess technically Pete too, and Joan, I don't know. I feel like he should say something.
I was thinking the contents of his message to Roger are directly derived from observing Lane's situation. What
Oh,
is this
of
for?
course.
Why are we doing this? And in this case where Lane's world has just been burnt to the ground, what does Don Draper have left professionally, and what are they doing? Where are they spending their time? So it becomes sort of no time like the present. We need to do something. He's off of Love Leaf now. He's focused back on the creative mission. And then when they founded this firm, it was ambitious. They wanted to build something, and it seems like he's very much doubling down on that initial vision, and it's lighting a fire under him, which I think, Roger's probably wondering, where is this coming from all of a sudden?
Yes, he has a couple of really key lines where we see Don's focus is dreaming bigger and doing more, going after more impressive clients instead of mediocre scraps or coat check girls, as he says. And I think we like when Don Draper's frustration is fuel for something constructive. We like seeing him want to really go somewhere with the business. He says this delusion that we're going somewhere when we can't even pay Christmas bonuses. So we can see that with two meetings where Don is ready to take the business into the future and move forward, but we know Lane isn't going anywhere. There's nothing for him. So that line is not intended to be tragic for Don, and he has no idea where Lane is headed. I don't even think Lane knows that yet. But it's still, knowing what we know, it's terrible thinking about, okay, this really great thing is going to come out of this for our company at the expense, at the cost of Lane Price.
And, Ed Baxter comes up in this conversation. Don admits Ed Baxter had told him that, he was toxic. Roger reassures Don that that's not the case. Roger says, hey, look, I'll get you in front of Firestone, the premium tire company versus Dunlop, the second rate one. Don throws Ed Baxter's name out there at Dow as being one of those white whales that he'd like to try and land. And Roger instantly comes back that Ken is squeamish about it. And rather coldly, Don says, then fire him. I don't even think it's a fair characterization that Ken is a blocker, but it seemed like it was an easy excuse not to go tilt at that windmill. And it's clear now that, Don's not going to take the easy excuse. They will tilt at the windmill and let the chips fall where they may.
We have a truth call out in this scene where Don admits what he wrote in the letter is reasonably alienating to some clients. But Roger isn't beating him up for that. Roger is about moving forward too. So again, I think we like this energy for Don of trying hard at work. And I also think we kind of like it when the band gets back together, when Roger and Don are on the same team. When Megan answers the door to the apartment, Sally is very tearful, but Megan didn't know she was coming. Don never let her know. And when Sally complains about Betty and says she hates her and she's a phony, Megan defends her with, that's not true. So it's nice to see Megan taking a higher road, even if we know Betty wouldn't.
Yeah, and I feel for Megan. This has been thrown on her, so I think Betty thinks about sort of sticking this problem with her ex, but Megan is collateral damage here, and then the lack of sensitivity, and we know Don's got a lot going on at the current time, so it's understandable that maybe he forgets to update her.
Next, we see Ken waiting at the bar for Roger, who tells him they're going after Dow. Roger intentionally planned this drink so that Ken would be out when Ed Baxter called him. But Ken immediately counters by saying, oh, I'd hate to muck this up by bringing it up with Cynthia, even by accident. And then both Ken and Roger have some level of respect for the other's game and maneuvers here, which I appreciate.
Yeah, and it's interesting that Ken sticks to his guns if he's not going to jeopardize his family situation to pursue this business. But he does want to be in on the business in the event that Ed Baxter and Dow decide to go forward with the firm. His condition is he wants to be on the business, and he doesn't want Pete as a go-between.
Initially, I thought this was a little bit confusing. Ken's demand that if they get the business, Pete doesn't go to any meetings and Ken is forced onto it. I don't think that's a hard demand for Roger to accept. But I thought Ken didn't want to be caught between his father-in-law and his work. So now it looks like he only objects to courting the business. And we understand Ed Baxter really didn't like the letter Don wrote. But I guess Ken is saying, okay, if Ed can get over Don writing the letter, then those complications are easier. But I do still think there are going to be complications with the firm. And we saw that with Tom and Pete. So I think this is the difference between Tom giving Pete his business and then yanking it away to punish Pete, and Roger earning Ed's business and Ken profiting from it without doing anything underhanded to get it.
And the guy who's going to be the most upset about this arrangement, of course, is Pete. Pete's over accounts. If they landed this giant whale, he's going to be outraged that Roger has negotiated him out of any involvement without his knowledge or consent. And then Ken, who I don't think Pete is feeling all that competitive with lately. Pete kind of won that war. But something like this is going to resurrect that sense of competitiveness and this idea that there's important business for the firm that is outside Pete's purview. It's almost like a Roger with American Tobacco Part 2 here, only this time it'll be Ken and Dow.
I noticed that too because it seemed like Pete and Ken were getting along much better recently. But I think there are two factors that are at play here. I think Ken is better at putting his bad feelings aside anyway. So I'm sure he remembers the bad history and just kind of gets along. But there are two other things. I think it was really notable that when Roger asks what Ken wants and suggests a kind of partnership, Ken says, "No, I don't want to be a partner. I've seen what's involved." So of course, Ken put two and two together about Herb's proposal and then Joan becoming a partner. And that was a red line he would not have crossed. If Ken had been in the room when the partners were first discussing that, it might all have gone differently. So I think that's one thing that Ken is upset with Pete about, not because he feels like he's defending Joan, but because he just feels like that's the wrong way to do business.
Well, and I think that touches on the fundamental difference between Ken and Pete. I think it's raw ambition. It seems to me that Ken has plenty of ambition, but there are limits to it. We know Pete has no such qualms. He made the Joan thing happen. He made the business with his father-in-law happen and leveraged the relationship as a means of getting the father-in-law to do what he wants.
And the second thing I think that is on Ken's mind when he wants to shove Pete off the business is, well, first, we've seen Pete showing off this season, and it's not a great look. But we also know Pete ratted Ken out for his writing to Roger in Signal 30. So I'm a little disappointed Ken isn't as easygoing and happy with his status as he appeared to be, but it also makes sense. This is his chance to drive a stake into Pete Campbell's side, and he's human like the rest of us.
Don bumps into Roger in the elevator, and Roger lets him know that he's talked to Ed and that Don is set up to meet him on Monday. It's kind of funny when Don complains about only having 48 hours to prepare, and Roger has no sympathy for it. And I think Roger tries to bolster him a little bit when he says, "I like that guy I saw today. I missed him." This hungry, ambitious Don who's not going to take no for an answer anymore.
Don Draper, back in business, ready to work wonders. When Don gets home, he finds Sally on the couch watching TV and eating chips. Megan's in the bedroom seething because Don never told her Sally was coming over. But then Don does tell her he had to fire Lane for stealing money from the company, and she's properly shocked by that. And Don being honest with Megan is something I keep appreciating because he wasn't with Betty so often. Even though maybe a little bit, he's telling Megan so that he can get out of being in trouble because he didn't call her about Sally. So Don just wants to get home and get to work to prepare for the Dow meeting. And Megan insists he's going to have dinner with his daughter. The work can wait until then. So I love seeing this work-life balance. It's possible for this man because here it is. When Megan manages Don, I feel like it's in service of his relationships and his health and not just to advance his career the way Trudy does to Pete.
And again, I think we see what a good partner Megan is. She has to sort of push through professional Don Draper to get to Father Don Draper. It's interesting. I don't think Betty puts up that fight with him if positions were switched.
We also haven't mentioned some of these comments Sally's made, but she's made some offhand remarks about He's not coming with us. He'll be miserable. She's in the habit of having Don not participate in her life. So Betty not expecting Don to participate is one thing, but Sally not expecting Don to participate is really sad. So I like that Megan's changing that around a little bit. When Lane gets home, he's drunk. Really, really drunk. But Rebecca is happy to see him. And this season, since she's been back in the US, we've seen her be very positive and supportive to Lane, and that was not the case early on. And I am so glad for that small mercy that she upped her game and gave it her all, and she's kind to Lane here. I wish they had a better partnership so that he could have been more honest with her. But Rebecca says she's proud of Lane. She wants to congratulate him on the 4A's position, which seems like a lifetime ago now, but it was just that morning. And of course, that's going to go away too, so he can't go celebrate that with her.
Instead of a partner who's trying to manage the liquidity and tackle these things together, she's actually a source of some of the liquidity problem because she's not read into just how tight the cash is. And she's continuing to spend based on a level of success and lifestyle that she assumes they can afford. But Lane knows that they cannot. If he was in a situation where she was more aware and more of a partner in those details which have been kept from her, maybe that gives him more of a home base and a source of strength and support.
I 100% agree with that. If they had a more secure foundation between each other, and if he had been more honest, they would be in a much better position here. I'm not putting that on her.
And she says, she says to him, "You never spend on yourself," when she unveils the Jaguar. And you can see she has the best of intentions here. She thinks they can afford this. She thinks he deserves it and he won't get it for himself. They can't afford it. And it's such a sweet gift. It shows that she's really thinking about him. And it just shows how clueless she is for the reasons Lane doesn't spend on himself. And we can see the sick look on Lane's face because he knows they can neither afford it. He knows that they're actually in a much worse situation than they were when he went to work this morning. And he's just written another check. The money's leaking out as fast as he can replenish it.
Lane won't sit in the car. He won't drive it. His full reaction is to throw up in the corner. His worst day ever has been made even worse. And the very symbol of his failure, and his wife is so thrilled to hand it to him. Lane in the foreground, just sick and green as the car, and Rebecca in the background, smiling, so happy to have done this. It's even more sad in an already tragic day. Later that weekend, we see Lane and Rebecca, and she encourages him to take a drive. But again, Lane is avoiding that for obvious reasons. He says, "I don't feel right driving until I've taken care of some of these errands I've let go." It's Sunday, he was fired on Friday, and I feel like at this point, he's arrived at his elegant exit. So it seems to me he's arranging his papers with that in mind here. Do you think he's made that decision already?
Yeah, that's my impression. He's trying to tidy things up so that the situation she inherits will at least be in as good a order as can be.
And the last words we see Lane have to his wife are, "There'll be plenty of time, dear."
The next scene is in a diner where we have Megan, Sally, and Megan's friend Julia. And we can see Sally very much desperately wanting to be another adult at the table. And it seems like Julia kind of forgets that Sally is a child. But Sally's eager to jump in and demonstrate that, she knows what's going on and she can talk about those things.
Sally orders a coffee and the waiter brings her some, and that pleases her so much. And there's a lot of theater of the grown-up in the process of growing up, and most shows miss that, I think. As the friend is talking about some guys she's dating, Sally offers that she has a boyfriend, and that's news to Megan. Megan's advice about boyfriends is more like a big sister. It's protective, but it's not like a mom, which I think Sally appreciates in this moment for sure. And I think it matters because later in this episode, we see Sally seeking out her mom specifically.
And I think it's a great balance that Megan strikes there because the advice she gives Sally doesn't ring to Sally like talking down to her as a child, But we as adults realize Megan's not talking to her like an adult. I think Megan finds the sweet spot with her advice in a way that doesn't alienate or upset Sally.
Next, we see Lane go to the parking garage with a bag of supplies. He goes to the XKE, and we see him stuffing a rag and hose in the exhaust pipe, drinking from a bottle. And Lane breaks his glasses very deliberately and with some satisfaction. And remember when we met him, his secretary reminded him to take his spectacles off before the head Brits were coming to visit? These glasses are a symbol of weakness and his deficiencies in his mind. And I actually think about this scene a lot because you know how you have conversations in the car with people who have wronged you? Or maybe that's just me. And you imagine how you're going to show them and what elegant thing you'll say. And then when you're actually in that moment, all you say is like, hey, bruh, you know? So to me, it's not just that the car won't start when he's decided to kill himself. It's him having to hold up one eyepiece and try to fix the motor one-handed in this dim garage. He didn't even get the satisfaction there. Even in that very small thing, it was denied to him. I've rewatched this so many times, and I honestly dread this episode. But I remember the first time I saw it, I thought Lane was spared here. That all the references to suicide this season were canceled out by what Bert said. They're lemons. They never start. So in spite of the fact that he was brought so low, I hoped that this would mean, okay, you're not going to do this.
Back at the Draper apartment, Sally's on the phone with Glenn. And I think in keeping with this spirit of how adult she is, she tells him that she wants him to come to the city and visit her for the day. He's going to make the effort, which involves a 20-minute bike ride and then a 2-hour train ride to get into the city.
It's kind of weird because really Sally and Glen could arrange this visit with parental knowledge any weekend. But there's something about wanting to do it their own way without adults, even though there's no nefarious intent. And the only reason Sally is alone on the Monday morning is because Megan has an audition and Dawn has to work. And Dawn didn't want to fight with Megan about who had to take her to school. It's just Sally taking advantage of this opportunity.
And Glenn has to prove himself by making the effort to come and see her. So I think it is a test for Glenn, which I think he perceives.
Next, we see Lane going into his office. It's still the weekend. He drops his keys going in. He's not striding forward. He's shuffling to collect his keys. His coat is still on. The glass with the drink from Dawn when he was fired or encouraged to resign is still on his desk. And he types a letter. And I want so much for there to be some miracle cure. He's typing his own version of a letter that will shake up the company and make him a hero. But not everybody gets to be that.
On Monday morning, Megan's leaving the apartment. And as soon as Megan's out the door, Sally's up and getting ready to enact her plan to meet up with Glenn.
Megan's directives are, do your homework, don't watch TV all morning, and don't use the juicer. Monday morning, first thing, Dawn and Roger wait to go into the meeting with Dow Chemical. At one point, Dawn asks him, what happened to your enlightenment? And Roger answers, I don't know, it wore off.
He got some good mileage out of it, so. I also like how he sort of tries to bolster Dawn's instincts, and he's, tells him to keep his cool, but if he baits you, punch him in the balls.
Do you find those are words to live by?
I think it's not bad advice here, right? They're trying to show some teeth. They know Ed Baxter's hostile to Dawn, so he needs to do something to get Ed's attention and to get Ed to move off the letter and think about the possibilities of future business. So I think it's good advice in this instance.
Back at the apartment, Glenn arrives and Sally answers the door. She's all done up. She's wearing the boots Dawn wouldn't let her wear to the awards dinner. And he says the worst thing he could say. He says, you don't look that different, when she wants very much to be grown up and for everybody to see it. I really hate Glenn walking into the apartment and saying, there's a kid at school whose parents have one better than this. It has a second floor. And he's trying to be blasé. I do feel like it's realistic, but it's not very likable. And Glenn suggests they go to the museum, which honestly is a lot more constructive and appropriate than what I was afraid he would suggest.
We see them, looking at the exhibits and making some cracks and enjoying them. And then we get a little bit of a confession here from Glenn where he talks about getting bullied at the school. He gets really candid when he talks about that he lied about seeing her and told these bullies that, she was his girlfriend and he was going to the city to have sex with her.
And at this point in the conversation, they clarify that they're not dating and don't like each other that way. Both of them seem good with that. Another piece of this uncomfortable conversation is Glenn talks about being bullied, and Sally's nice, and she says, well, Henry was picked on when he was little, and now he runs the city. And there's a truth call out there. And then Sally says, I keep wishing he would leave her. I know it's wrong. And I get the feeling she says that not because she dislikes Henry and wants her parents back together, but because she wants to see her mother punished. And that's a pretty dark wish. It's not as dark as Sally can sleep with the doorman for all I care, but still. And I don't even know if Sally means it. I mean, I think she's trying to show bravado in a way that Glenn did too.
Yeah, that's how I take it. Tough teenage talk, and it kind of parallels Glenn's own fibs and exaggerations. Sally being as negative and hostile about Betty as she ever gets. I guess it's an honest expression of the frustration that she feels with Betty and sort of wanting to get back at her.
Sally excuses herself and discovers she got her period. We know she goes home after this in a cab, and I can't help but wonder what Betty's going to think about those go-go boots when she sees them.
Well, it was Dawn who was against the go-go boots, so I wonder if Betty cares about that at all.
Oh, I think she will definitely read that as, oh, that's a Megan thing, and therefore it's bad.
Poor old Glenn's left in the museum in the Africa section, wondering where Sally disappeared to.
Speaking of being kept waiting, Ed Baxter keeps Don and Roger waiting for about 2 hours before they go in. This speech, I think, is one of Don Draper's intensely delivered mic drops. He's very prepared with details about Dow's products, and essentially his argument is that greed is good, and he wants to fight to get them the whole of any segment of business, not just the majority. His line is, you don't want most of it, you want all of it, and I won't stop until you get all of it. And it's clear Ed Baxter is very intrigued by the Don Draper magic in spite of himself.
Yeah, I really think Don Draper magic is a great way to describe what we're seeing here because we can see the hunger, the ambition. He is completely knowledgeable about their product lines, their market shares, and the possibilities. And just to quickly touch on the letter, Ed seems to want to beat Don over the head one more time about the letter, and Roger helps shut that down right off the start. I also love the rhetorical flourish when Don says, are you happy with 50%? Because there's no right answer to it. It's like, does your father still steal? There's no right answer. Yes, he still does. No, he doesn't steal anymore. This puts everybody on the spot because nobody can say, yeah, we're content where we are. We don't want more share. We don't want more business. And then if they're boxed in on that premise that they do need more business and they do need to grow, his solution makes sense and it needs to be something they contemplate. It almost seems to imply that if you don't contemplate it, then you must be guilty of that lack of ambition and being content. So even in terms of controlling the conversation after running through this pitch, it's Don who shuts it down and thanks them for their time and basically ends the meeting, which is hilarious given that they had to wait just to get in for the scheduled meeting. And I just love when they get in the elevator and Roger says he'll buy him a drink if he wipes the blood off his mouth.
Megan comes home and calls for Sally and sees Glenn's gym bag there, but no Sally. At lunch the day before, Sally just talked about having a boyfriend, so Megan's brain has to be in hyperdrive at this point.
We've seen Don Draper react when Megan hasn't looked after his children to his satisfaction. So I share Megan's apprehension here.
So Sally goes home to Betty, and she says, I got my period and I just wanted to come home. And that fits. No matter how annoying a teenager finds their parents, that comfort piece is there. And no matter how insufferable a teen is, that comfort instinct is there. So it's hard to believe in the scene that Betty is so surprised by Sally's hug. Betty can still be an unhappy, unsuitable mother and give hugs to her kids. We saw her being comforting in season 1, so it's not like Dawn, who wasn't raised with any kind of affection. She knows how to do this. So again, I find this a little bit unfair to Betty. I just don't believe that she's not hugging her children ever, and that in this one moment there's this isolated rare hug.
Well, that's initiated by Sally to Betty's surprise, and then Betty sort of recovers and returns the hug. I'm with you. I don't like the writing here. I think even Betty Draper or Betty Francis is going to be right in there to comfort her daughter with this scary moment, which I think is ironic in the sense that Sally is so desperate to be an adult. Well, here is one of the biological changes that marks adulthood, and it's frightening. It's more than she can handle. It overwhelms her, and then she's seeking solace and comfort from her mother in this moment. And it's, one of those careful what you wish for moments. And I think Betty would handle it more smoothly and effortlessly than she's allowed to in this scene.
At the office, Scarlett rings the company records by Joan's office, alerting her that Mr. Price isn't in yet. So we don't know to feel tense yet, unless we've seen it before, and then we know to feel tense about that.
Well, I think Lane is not one to come in late, too. He's probably regular like clockwork, where some of the man children like Roger and Dawn, perhaps, depending on what they're doing the night before. I imagine they come in late all the time.
Megan's home calling for Dawn because Sally's missing when Glenn appears at the apartment. He's super defensive and self-absorbed and really over trying to find Sally at this point. And Megan's actually trying to figure out what happened to Sally. She gets a call from Betty, who says Sally's back at their house. And I'm glad Betty calls to let Megan know because she's worried. But Betty is also calling to rub it into Megan. Sally might like to spend the weekend with Megan, but Betty is the one with the mom credentials.
And I don't get the sense that Megan is competing with Betty to mother Sally at all. I think Megan is just trying to step up as the stepmom in this circumstance. The competition is wholly in Betty's mind.
I think so too. Next, we see Joan taking the papers to Lane's office, but the door won't open all the way. And when she goes to the office next door, they stand on top of the couch and look through the glass and discover the truth. And even though they don't show it, their reactions give you the full horror of this moment. Christina Hendricks is great in this. She holds it together, even though she knows from the moment she tries to open the door. But it's not real until someone else sees it too.
Yeah, it's such an interesting reveal of Lane's suicide. And I agree with you. Christina Hendricks kills it in this scene. Just the look on her face. It's such a shock and such a tragedy. And it's painted less vividly across the faces of Ken, Pete, and Harry. But we can see something that's occurred here that is just beyond anything they imagined.
And even in this detail, Pete and Harry are overcome with their own reactions. And it's Ken who goes to Joan to put his arm around her and comfort her. Ken is the one who thinks about somebody else. Of course, Pete and Harry don't worry about that.
Back at the Francis household, Sally's on the bed and Betty comes in to check on her. And we can see Sally is still struggling with this, feeling embarrassed. And we get to see Betty be a mother here. She comforts her, has her slide over so she can lay down with her and just be there for her in this moment. And I think Betty's happy to be there for Sally and is embracing this role of motherhood. In so many other situations, it seems like she rebels against or objects to somehow the imposition of it.
Sally and Betty together not fighting is really nice. But this line, Betty says 2 sentences and then she finishes with, "Maybe someday you'll have a daughter and can tell her all this." And I always think, how much all is there to tell? You just said 2 sentences. But at least it's an honest moment between them. And I think this scene is an echo back to Lane to show how you could ask for help, you could ask for comfort, and it could be there for you. Sally reaches out to Betty, who's not very comforting all the time, and she finds it. And later, Glenn reaches out to Megan and Dawn and finds it. But Lane doesn't.
Dawn and Roger come back in after celebrating their meeting with Dow to find the office is empty, and Bert, Joan, and Pete are sitting in the break room. They let them know that Lane has hanged himself in his office. Roger offers to take Joan home, and Pete mentions they're waiting for the coroner to come take him away. We can see the impact of this on Don Draper. He knows exactly why this occurred. It has devastating parallels to his own experience with his half-brother, And then when he finds out that they haven't cut him down, that springs him to answer. And I think Don Draper finds peace in taking action because it allows him to set aside the emotions that are maybe difficult to deal with, and then you can take positive action. So in this case, just the decency of cutting down the body and laying Lane on the sofa in his office, rather than think about his involvement in what led Lane to take this dramatic step.
You can see and feel that Don blames himself and that this is Adam all over again. And if he had done something different, Lane might still be alive. I personally think Don bears more responsibility for Adam than for Lane. Firing Lane was the right thing to do. He didn't do it because he enjoyed it or because he wanted to score points. He did it for the right reasons, because he couldn't trust Lane ever again. And ironically, trust for Don Draper is essential.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Don is as reasonable and thoughtful in the termination of Lane as could be hoped for in the circumstances. But if he harbors insecurities about his treatment of Adam and how his need to cover up his past, directly contributed to Adam's feeling of isolation and then suicide, it makes sense to me that with no one to share this with and no one to reassure him that he's not at fault, that's leaching over, and that deep down he has a fear and concern that he may have contributed to it. We also find out the contents of the letter Lane was typing in the middle of the night. It's a boilerplate resignation letter, and it just feels so sad and lonely that this man has hanged himself in his office and wrote a nondescript resignation letter.
When we think about Lucky Strike and Lee Garner Jr. being so awful with Sal and the Santa suit, and how the financial loss was so terrible, but how freeing it was otherwise without that monkey on their backs of that client. And here they've just gotten Jaguar, and the cost has already been Joan to some extent and Lane. And the truth is, all of those partners could have been kinder to Lane and to each other for that matter. Joan didn't have to sleep with Lane, and Don didn't have to bankroll him, but there was a lot more respect they could have shown him, and they all have a piece to own in that. Roger once told Don, the reason you're not good at relationships is because you don't value them. And he's certainly taken people for granted, but all of them have. I really want to go back and look and see all the instances where Lane said something, and particularly Roger and Pete and Don and Bert just rolled right over him without acknowledging what Lane had to say. I do want to make a note of the Mets pennant Lane's had hanging in his office. Baseball is such an American thing, and it's a small but important symbol of Lane's embrace of the U.S. But he doesn't pick the Yankees. He picks the Mets, a team that consistently has losing seasons the whole time he's been in the U.S. Like Lane, they're in the league, but they're not winning.
Lane should have hung on another couple of years. In 1967, at the time he hangs himself, the 69 Mets win the World Series. I think the tragedy of Lane's character, you don't lay it at the door of the partners there, although they certainly contribute to, the latest awful chapter in it. We can see how it goes back much further, and it's the lack of honesty in his marriage. It's the relationship he has with the firm, when they buy Sterling Cooper. It's such a tragic ending. We know the hurt that Lane has suffered at the hands of his father, and that just his whole need to get away from the UK itself and start fresh in America, a land where there's just not this concern and care about, where you're from and what your pedigree is and all the rest of it. So it's like the American dream turned into the American nightmare, but it still hurts. It's still tragic. And I think Jared Harris acted the character so well. We really feel Lane's pain through to the end and feel the tragedy of his demise.
When Don gets home, he finds Glen there with Megan. I have several issues with this next plot point. I've mentioned I'm not a fan of the Glen scenes, generally speaking. So it really doesn't do anything believable for me to see Don interacting with Glen to understand himself better or to commiserate about their bad days together in the elevator. And I'm also so shaken up about Lane, I'm not ready to do any palate cleansing with Glen. However, I also can't believe Megan and Don would be so accepting that Glen just showed up at their apartment in secret and then trust that he and Sally did go to the museum. Don wouldn't even let Sally wear makeup to the awards dinner. So when he finds out Glenn showed up unannounced and unsupervised, I know he's got other things on his mind, but I don't believe he would be quite that cool about it.
I think he's totally distracted. So I'm going to say I'm okay with it, but only as long as he's distracted. Because absolutely, once his mind focuses back on protecting his young daughter, Glenn's going to be in trouble.
And by the end of the episode, Don extends some grace to Glenn that he didn't show to Lane. And he asks, if you could do anything, what would you do? And the scene cuts to Glenn driving Don's car. Like Greg once said, I can't fix everything, but I can fix this.
Yeah, and I think the whole driving Glenn back to his school, how long a drive that is, that this is another action escape for Don Draper. It'll give him some time behind the wheel. And he doesn't tell Megan before he departs either. So she has yet to find out just how awful this day has turned out.
I think in the fandom, some people find this scene really satisfying because almost nobody gets what they want. He said happiness is just a moment before you need more happiness. But for this one moment, you can feel happy by making this thing come true, even if everything else falls apart. And Don once tried to fix things for Suzanne by driving her brother to his new job, and he couldn't end up doing that. So this, for Glenn, he can achieve it, and it's a bit of a do-over. And I hate to be glass half empty, but I think it's just I'm not invested in Glenn's character, but I don't get the beauty in it from this. I'd like to, but I don't feel a reprieve from the ick and sadness by Glenn getting this particular dream fulfilled. I wish I did.
Yeah, I think I echo that perspective. It's a small diversionary task for Don Draper. Giving Glenn a little win in terms of driving puts a bit of a sheen on his crappy day. But I'm with you. I'm just left looking at this smoking crater that was Lane Price's life, and I don't care at all about Glenn getting back to school.
The closing song is Lovin' Spoonful's Butchie's Tune, which was the 1966 B-side to Summer in the City. Here's a fun fact. When I Googled the lyrics that play at the end, which are, I ain't got time for the things on my mind and I'm leaving, the AI search result preview told me, I hear you loud and clear. When you need to get going, you just need to get going. If you've got a busy schedule, I can help you look into travel conditions and transit options. So thank you for that, AI. But actually, I was looking for the lyrics. When you read them through as a goodbye from Lane, it's just, please don't cry when the time to part has come. It's not for what you've said or anything you've done. And there's also, I'll even close the door so you won't see me go. They mentioned the poem Ozymandias in a recent episode, and reading that with a Lane lens is also extra tragic with the lines, I met a traveler from an ancient land, and nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. And there's that eternal question for humans about what is my purpose, and have I made a difference to those around me and those who come afterward? When Lane comes into Sterling Cooper, I resent him a little bit as a newcomer who's untrustworthy, and there's duck on your mind, and you expect Lane is going to be an adversary to Don, I think. And in spite of his lies and his complete ethical failure, you come to care for him, and this loss feels so complete. I feel like when Adam died, it was sad, and you could feel Don's responsibility in it, but we know so much more what Lane has suffered and what brought him here, so the pain feels so much stronger.
Lane was always a bit of a fish out of water. We could see the schism between him and his own firm. We could see him as a bit of a foil to the Americans because, he was the one in the office who had authority. I guess I always felt I was rooting for him to become more fully integrated and really, truly part of it. And yet there was always seemed to be something sort of keeping him a little bit on the outside looking in. So to see it come to an end here in such an awful way, it feels dissatisfying. It was an arc that I was hoping would end much more favorably and happily, and it just didn't. It's denied. So I think, we talk about Mad Men's not for everybody. But I think for a lot of people that's irritating and frustrating. It is for me as well. But I guess I like the story, even though it's tragic and painful.
I saw an interview with Jared Harris where he talked about when Matthew Weiner said to him, "Hey, why don't you come up and have a drink with me?" And he was like, "What, am I getting written out of the show?" And then it turns out the drink he wanted to have with him was to let him know that this was what was happening with his character. It was a panel interview, and Robert Morse, who plays Bert Cooper, said, "But I think that storyline was so," and I can't remember the word he used, special. It wasn't magical. It certainly wasn't. But even though it is tragic, there is something so memorable. If you ask people, what's the saddest thing in Mad Men, there are a lot of choices, but this definitely ranks. And I don't think it would be so touching if Jared Harris hadn't brought so much humanity and complexity to this character. Our listener shout out today goes to Dee. Thank you so much for your very kind feedback about this podcast on Spotify. We're so grateful to you for taking the time to support us.
That's it for this episode of All Things Mad Men, from Chip and Dip to Zooby Zoo. Visit our website, madmenctozee.com, to vote for your favorite sterling lines and to share your opinions on our double dip questions for each episode.
You can find us on Instagram and YouTube at MadmenC2Z, and please listen, like, and subscribe. That's what the podcast's for.
Thanks for listening, everybody.